I'm Randy Leedy, your New Testament Greek guy. You see my web address and the 10% coupon code there at the top of the screen. I'll talk more about the website at the end of this presentation. Our topic today is one that gives a lot of Greek students a lot of grief: the genitive absolute construction. Let's start with some orientation. What we're going to do here is kind of zoom way out and talk about some basic grammatical constructions, and then step by step we'll zoom in on the genitive absolute. Let's talk about adverbial material within sentences, since the genitive absolute is an adverbial construction. You know the basic parts of speech, verbs and nouns and adjectives and so forth. Well, adverbs provide more information about a verb's action or state, expressing at what time, for how long, in what manner, by what means, due to what cause, for what purpose, with what result, etc. the verb's action or state takes place. Now, there are many different sentence structures that can function adverbially. Let's take an overview. Some of these structures will have no verb at all. Others will have a verb. For each one, we'll consider what part of speech is involved, the nature of the specific construction, and then look at a brief example. So without a verb, most basically, you could have an adverb. Nouns or other substantives can function adverbially. And then prepositional phrases also function very commonly as adverbs. And the specific construction in each case is just a simple modifier. Some examples. He came immediately. Immediately tells when he came. It's an adverb. He came by night. Nuktos is a genitive case noun used adverbially. Prepositional phrase. He came into the city. All right, some adverbial constructions do have a verb. You could have a finite verb. That's a verb with person and number. You could have an adverbial participle, or you could have an adverbial infinitive. An adverbial construction with a finite verb would be a subordinate clause, a clause introduced by a subordinating conjunction. With adverbial participles, we have two kinds, the simple adverbial participle and the genitive absolute participle. And then there are various constructions with the adverbial infinitive. As an example of a finite verb used adverbially, he came when I called. When, hata, is the subordinating conjunction. Ephonesa is a first-person singular finite verb. As a simple adverbial participle, we could have he came running, with trekon expressing the manner of the coming. For the genitive absolute participle, it sounds a little awkward. He came, I having called. And that would be equivalent in meaning to the construction with the finite verb, he came when I called. Of course, we'll be talking at great length about the genitive absolute later on. And then as a very simple adverbial infinitive, you would have the sentence, he came to save sinners, with sosi expressing the purpose of the coming. Of course, we're going to focus now on the genitive absolute participle, one of the two participial constructions used adverbially. So let's zoom in a little bit and talk about basic participle grammar. Not genitive absolute grammar, not adverbial participle grammar, but very basic participle grammar that applies to all uses of the participle. The participle is a verbal adjective by definition, or you could say that it's an adjectival form of a verb. Its lexical source is a verb, but it's declined for gender, number, and case like an adjective. So in its very form, it has elements of being both a verb and an adjective. Now, as a verb, it must have an expressed or implied subject, often called its referent. As an adjective, the participle indicates its connection to its referent by agreeing with the referent in gender, number, and case. Of course, we'll be seeing examples of this as we go along. Now let's zoom in a little tighter. Adverbial participle grammar. The adverbial participle supplies an action or state that expresses some additional proposition logically connected to the governing verb. It is always anarthrous, that means it lacks the article. Not all anarthrous participles are adverbial. There are many other uses of the participle that can be anarthrous, but the adverbial participle is always anarthrous. The adverbial participle usually has the subject of the governing verb as its referent. In the example I gave earlier, he came running. The same person does the running as does the coming. The adverbial participle is therefore usually nominative. And you see the bold-faced type here calling attention to an important factor that we'll need to remember as we consider the genitive absolute. Now some examples of adverbial participles. We're going to take a sentence I've already used about somebody coming running, and we're going to play with it with different subjects involved to see how the adverbial participle behaves. So suppose I, as a masculine speaker, came running. Eilthon trekon, masculine nominative singular. I'm the one who did the running, and I'm in the governing clause, I came, as the understood subject of eilthon. I am masculine singular. Therefore, the participle trekon must be masculine singular nominative in form to agree with its referent. If I were a female and said I came running, then I would say eilthon treku sa, nominative singular, but this time feminine, agreeing with the subject of the verb. Let's shift to the third person. She came running. Still obviously a feminine subject, so the participle will be the same, feminine nominative singular. What if we had a group of women who came running? They, feminine, came running. Well, then you'd have to have a plural participle, eilthon trekusai. And the verb is now third plural, the participle feminine nominative plural. How about if the children come running? Well, here I have expressed the subject, eilthen ta tekna. Singular verb, eilthen, with a neuter plural subject, ta tekna, as Greek typically does. And then I need a participle that agrees with the neuter plural subject, ta tekna. So trekon ta is neuter nominative plural. Now, occasionally, the adverbial participle's referent is an element of the governing clause other than the subject. And so the adverbial participle could be in the genitive, dative, or accusative in agreement with another element of the sentence. So here's an example. He came to me as I was running. If in English class you just said he came to me running, if you meant he came to me while I was running, your teacher would ding you for having a dangling participle. In English, the participles must have the same subject as their governing verb. But that's because English doesn't have inflected endings on its participles. Greek suffers no such limitation, and so you can say eilthen prasme trekon ta, and it's very clear that the one doing the running is not the one who did the coming, because trekon ta is masculine singular accusative, agreeing with me. Now that form trekon ta could be neuter plural like it was in an earlier example, but in this context there's nothing neuter plural for it to agree with. It has to be masculine singular agreeing with me. Now there's a linguist named Martin Cooley who doesn't believe that this construction is possible. He wants to take trekon ta as adjectival rather than adverbial, but I don't believe he's made his case for that thesis at all, and I hope it doesn't take strong root among Greek grammarians and exegetes. Now my activities these days have a strong focus on sentence diagramming, so I want to use sentence diagramming as a means of being able to visualize how these participles work. In sentence diagram form, the adverbial participle would appear like this. It sits on a little shelf under the verb that it modifies. So trekon tells us the manner of coming, and so it sits there as an adverb modifying the verb eilthen. The parenthetical x on the left of the verb eilthen is, of course, the understood subject. He, she, or it came running. And of course, the participle can have its own direct object, modifiers, and so forth. You can have quite long participle phrases with lots of little diagramming widgets attached to them. Okay, so now let's zoom all the way in on the genitive absolute. How does it fit into this discussion? Well, what is a Greek speaker to do when he or she wants to use an adverbial participle with a referent that appears nowhere in the governing clause? Not only is it not the subject of the governing clause, it's nowhere in the governing clause. Here's an English sentence as an example. The power being off, the alarm clock did not ring. Now that participle's referent, the word power, has no sentence function dictating its case. The main clause is the alarm clock did not ring. The word power is not in the main clause. The word power has no grammatical connection except as the subject of the participle being, but it does not take its case from the participle. The participle takes its case from the referent. So we don't know what case the participle being is going to be in a Greek sentence until we know what case to put the word power in. If Greek were to default to the nominative case for the word power, there would be the risk of confusion in some sentences when you wouldn't be able to tell which nominative was the subject of which verb form. So the Greek convention is to put the participle's referent in the genitive case to signal grammatical disconnection. That's the meaning of the word absolute as a technical grammatical term, isolated or disconnected. Put the participle in the genitive to disconnect it from the main clause, as the reader senses no genitive case function for the referent, and then he sees a participle agreeing with it, or perhaps he sees the participle first and the referent later, depending on the word order, he gets the idea that this is set off as a separate section in the sentence apart from the main clause. That's the idea of the genitive absolute. And then, of course, the participle is then written in the genitive to agree with that genitive functioning absolutely as its referent. Of course, we're going to see examples of this as we go along. So here's a definition of the genitive absolute. It is an adverbial participle in the genitive case whose genitive case referent has no genitive case function in the governing clause. The term genitive absolute most directly describes the function of the referent rather than that of the participle. The participle is not absolute at all. It's an adverbial element modifying the governing verb. But the referent is absolute. Its genitive case indicates disconnection rather than a normal genitive case function like possession or source or subjective or something, since none of those functions will work in the context. Okay, some genitive absolute examples. Matthew 8:16, evening having come, they brought to him many demon-possessed people. My phrasing of the translation sounds a little awkward. We could smooth it out this way. And when evening had come, they brought. We've used the word when as the connecting conjunction here, sensing that the proper thought connection between the genitive absolute and the governing clause is that the genitive absolute expresses the time use. Here's what the sentence diagram would look like. Let's look at this fairly closely. You see that we have a modifier symbol here showing the genitive absolute as adverbial. It modifies the main verb. It's an adverbial participle construction. But you notice that the vertical portion of this line is dotted. That symbolizes the disconnection of the genitive case. If we had a solid line here, then as we read the diagram and saw the word opsias down here, we might think that we're looking at a normal genitive case adverbial modifier for this verb. But that's not what's happening. The dotted line shows that we're dealing with the absolute construction, where that genitive case noun is functioning only as the subject of the participle. And the participle is the word that especially has the adverbial connection back to the main verb, expressing time or cause or whatever as the case may be. So this is the diagramming convention for the genitive absolute participle. Here's another example. I'll read it in word order, which will sound a little strange. The lake, a wind great blowing, became rough. Now that sounds very rough, doesn't it? Pardon the pun. So let's see if we can smooth that out a little bit. The lake became rough, a strong wind blowing. Well, that's certainly an improvement. We could smooth it out even further by rendering it this way. The lake became rough because a strong wind was blowing. And our use of the conjunction because correlates with the sense we gain that this genitive absolute is expressing the cause of its governing verb. The strong wind blowing caused the lake to become rough. Okay, here's the sentence diagram form for that. Again, the word anemu, wind, has no genitive case function in the governing clause. You would not translate it with the word of. The lake of the wind became rough of the wind. No. Wind is just the subject of the genitive absolute participle. An example from Acts 18:21. I will return to you again, God willing. Now we use this expression precisely in our everyday language. We could still smooth it out a little bit though. I will return to you again if God wills. And we're using the word if because we're sensing the conditional use of the genitive absolute in this example. Can you envision now what the sentence diagram would look like? Hit your pause button if you need to think for a moment. It looks like this. Okay, one more example. Talk about convoluted. Listen to this word order. So many he signs having done before them, not they were believing in him. So that takes a little work to smooth that out, doesn't it? It comes out like this. He having performed so many signs before them, they were not believing in him. Now that still sounds pretty awkward to the English ear until we realize that the concession use of the genitive absolute fits here, and we can render that with the conjunction although. Although he had done so many signs before them, they were not believing in him. And again, a look at the diagram. I mentioned earlier that the genitive absolute can take its own object and modifiers. Here's a situation where the genitive absolute has some considerable extent to it, with additional diagramming symbols connected. Let's take a look at some statistics for genitive absolute usage in the New Testament. There are 738 genitive case participles in the Nestle-Aland edition of the Greek New Testament. 346 of those, by my count, are genitive absolutes. That means the percentage of genitive case participles functioning as genitive absolute is almost 50%, 47%. Now, we talked earlier about the fact that the genitive absolute participle is anarthrous. What percentage of anarthrous genitive participles are the absolute construction? Well, the number of anarthrous genitive participles is 473, and that yields a percentage of 73%. So when you encounter an anarthrous genitive participle in your Greek New Testament, there's almost a 3 out of 4 chance that you're looking at a genitive absolute construction. But you can't take that for granted. You could be mistaken. Let's consider some examples that might be mistaken as genitive absolutes when really that's not what they are at all. The first example I will show you has a glaring reason why it cannot be a genitive absolute. Let's see how quickly you can pick it up. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. What jumps off the screen at you as to why zontos cannot be a genitive absolute? It has the article. The genitive absolute must be anarthrous. So this participle is a simple adjective. Its referent is a genitive modifier of huios. The word theou is not absolute. The word theou is a genitive case modifier for huios, the Son of God. And the participle zontos is a simple attributive participle modifying theou. Romans 9:26 reads, "They shall be called sons of the living God." Same phrase as in the previous example, but no article this time, and the lack of the article makes zontos a little easier to mistake for a genitive absolute. But the diagramming and the usage are just the same as in the previous slide. This participle is a simple adjective, and its referent, theou, is a genitive modifier of huioi. So theou is not absolute. It has a genitive case use modifying huioi. Here's an example of a tricky construction that occurs quite often. The 2 disciples heard him speaking. Now, theoretically, this one could be a genitive absolute. The 2 disciples heard while he was speaking. But it's much better to understand this as an indirect discourse use of the participle. They heard him speaking. The speaking is part of what they heard. The word heard does not stand alone with no object, as it would if this construction were genitive absolute. Its object is the expression him speaking. And the participle's referent, autou, is in the genitive case because akouo often takes its direct object in the genitive case. So autou is connected by the genitive case to the governing clause as the object of akousan. The sentence diagram would look like this, with that whole participle phrase raised on a stilt so that as a unit it functions together as the object of akousan. Now let's work on some refinements to our understanding. 7 times, by my count, the genitive absolute's referent is elliptical, which means it's omitted and must be understood from the context. So here's an example, Matthew 17:14. And they having come to the crowd, and you see the word they in parentheses because it's elliptical, a man came to him. In the larger context, they refers to Jesus and the disciples who've been off by themselves, and now they're coming back to the crowd. The genitive absolute is so common in Greek that where its referent can be clearly inferred from the context, the writer doesn't even have to express it. If you try to take alphonton in any other way than as a genitive absolute, you will search in vain to find any genitive plural referent for that participle anywhere in the sentence. Here's how it would look in a sentence diagram. Just use the elliptical parenthetical X in the subject slot with alphonton as the verb of the construction. Often, the genitive referent also reappears in the governing clause. Matthew 5:1 is an example. He having sat, his disciples came to him. Autou in blue refers to Jesus, of course, but then Jesus occurs not just once, but twice in the governing clause, in both the dative and the genitive. So does this construction violate the definition of a genitive absolute? The genitive absolute's referent is not supposed to be anywhere in the governing clause. Okay, here's how to resolve this. This phenomenon does not violate the idea of the construction's absoluteness, since it remains true that the first autou, think about the Greek word, not about the person referred to by the word, but think about that first autou as a Greek word. That word has no genitive case function within the governing clause. When Jesus as the person, not as a word, but Jesus as a person, reappears in the governing clause in the genitive, you have a separate word, the red autou. So the genitive absolute construction does not require that the person or thing referred to by the participles referent appear nowhere in the governing clause. The genitive absolute only requires that the word functioning as the participles referent have no grammatical function within the governing clause. That's a very important clarification. We won't look at a diagram here because I don't think a diagram will contribute anything to our understanding of the matter. Now, the governing clause may be a subordinate clause rather than the main clause. Almost all the examples I have given have been ones in which the governing clause was also the sentence's main clause. But here's a little bit more complicated sentence in Hebrews 4:1. Let us fear, therefore, lest a promise to enter into his rest having been left to us, any of you may seem to fall short. There are quite a number of verb forms in this verse. Which one does the participle katalepomenes modify adverbially? Well, we don't have time to work through all the possibilities, but here's the best connection. Let us fear lest any of you should seem to fall short in spite of having this promise left. So the best connection is to the subjunctive dake, even though that's not the main clause of the sentence. The genitive absolute can be buried quite deeply in a sentence's grammar. All right, congratulations. By suffering through this whole long video, you have now guaranteed yourself never ever to misunderstand a genitive absolute again. If only it were so simple. At the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned my website, www.ntgreekguy.com. There, you will find complete sentence diagrams for the Greek New Testament in PDF form, a 10% discount with the coupon code DDOG. There's also a free book on request only with diagrams purchase. Information about that book is on the site, of course. If you're interested in drawing sentence diagrams in PowerPoint, I have a free environment for you to use for that purpose. There's also a Microsoft Word macro for those of you that may have materials using the old BibleWorks Greek font and would like to convert those to Unicode using the font of your choice from those installed on your system. It works very reliably. There are also links to resources for sentence diagramming, a YouTube video channel, and a Facebook discussion group. So come and check out the site, see if I can serve you in your efforts to be a faithful exegete of God's Word in the New Testament.